So we're in chapter 13 of your economics book. We're in the second session now, global issues in perspective. This session, this chapter is so important because it's what's going on in the world today, as we can see and look into the Bible and see things coming together that we would never suspect would happen and couldn't happen in any other age. So it's important as we look in, a Bible and look into the future, the prophecies of the Bible, and we can look right here what globalism is. That world power. Right now we know the World Economic Forum, the United Nations, and everything all coming together as a world power. In fact, they said we're having a great reset. The great reset is the reset of the whole global world network now. Getting ready for power to come in and take over the world. You look at these words and you see them in the news and you think, what? But here we go. So it's basically taking away our sovereignty and our freedoms and putting it all into, a despot or a tyrant to come. So let's begin and go through this, and that's not all. This whole section doesn't really go into. You have to get in your Bible on this subject, but as you look, you can compare, can't you, to what's happening. So the global issues in perspective. Globalists like to talk about peace and prosperity. Even the Bible says they'll say peace, peace. At that time, and that's what they're looking. Globalists like to talk about peace and prosperity, and nations working together, and so they can relieve poverty and have free trade, and believing that free trade, free economic trade, control of the economic system will lead to peace. Now, do you think that really leads to peace? The Bible doesn't say that, does it? The Bible says that Jesus is the Prince of Peace. But anyway, a few people realize, though, this peace will mean sacrificing everything you have. Americans have much to lose, much freedom to lose in the midst of the call for peace in the global area. And there's four certain areas that we're going to go over. I think I'll go over 2 on this and then 2 in the next. But these areas, first is international trade. The international trade, we always thought we need international trade, to figure out these things, and we do need some. But how the international trade has came into a huge bureaucracy of control. So first, international trade, and then we'll go into the second being world peace. Of course, how do we promote world peace, and what's happening there on the scene of world peace with globalism, and on to humanitarian aid, helping countries, that are less developed. How do we solve poverty in the world? And then going on to environmentalism, and we talk about environmentalism, climate change, and all these things that have been on the news for the last 40 years, actually in the last 10 years, becoming very, very popular. So let's begin. We're going to start with international trade. International trade, world peace, humanitarian aid, and on to the environmentalism. So we have four areas. So let's talk about the international trade here. So it starts in here on page 210. Okay. International trade is basically what is wanted is the removal of trade barriers. So to have a global market where people and merchants and businesses can trade without paying taxes, right? In between tariffs and taxes between countries. And so the concept is free trade seems pretty good, doesn't it? But it's really quite deceiving, because the key is that the international trade has to be regulated by international organization or organizations, rather than sovereign states. So it's giving up your rights of saying saying who you want to trade with and who you don't want to trade with. So it's giving up the nation's best interests. And it also, the international trade is subject to numerous laws and statutes. So it's governing countries. And the worst thing happening now, we have this huge bureaucracy, all this paperwork and everything to go through, and it's very inefficient in the midst of it. And all these people are hired to do these little jobs to try to deal with world trade. And they have little insight into local national needs at all. They don't know anything about our country's economy, but they're going to try to control it, aren't they? So the paperwork costs billions of dollars every year, and it's supported by money from the governments that it represents. So we pay for this. It taxes us, our citizens, so we're paying for this World Trade, organization. And it has really now hardly any benefits of free trade at all. So all this money comes to them. What are they doing with it, And they submit it to the economic control of these distant bureaucracies. We're giving them taxes. We're paying taxes to them in that way to be part of this world trade. It transfers decisions to a remote, multilingual parliament accountable to no real public opinion, increasingly subordinate to a powerful bureaucracy. That's what it says right here. Well, actually, this is not. This thing here, I got to read this. This is Teddy Roosevelt. He says, which he's a strong nationalist, a strong patriot, and he's of America, and he says the man who loves other countries as much as his own stands on level with a man who loves other women as much as he loves his wife. He says, we can't stand and love other countries more than we love our own country, is what he's saying. I like that in the midst of all this. But let's go. There was another quote here, and this is by Margaret Thatcher. I kind of quoted part of it already, but it says, our choice is clear. Either we exercise democratic control of Europe through cooperation between national governments and parliaments, which have legitimately experience and closeness to the people. So we can either trust our own nations, or we can go and transfer our decisions to a remote multilingual parliament accountable to no real European opinion and thus increasingly subordinate to a powerful bureaucracy. I think I quoted that part of it. But so Margaret Thatcher of Great Britain back when said that. Says, do you want to just give up your your freedom to a foreign parliament clear across the world that knows nothing about you, is what she's saying. Do we really? So anyway, it says trade organizations have diminished national sovereignty. So what is national sovereignty? Well, it's that exclusive power of an independent state to rule and regulate international affairs without foreign interference. So what does that mean? Well, it really means that national sovereignty is that we can say whatever for our own country. Our country is sovereign to ourselves. We're not going to give up our freedoms to another country. That's national sovereignty. Now, you can call it nationalism. Nationalism is not a good word in a lot of senses, because a lot of national, you think of like Adolf Hitler. He was a nationalist, because he supported Germany, right? Everything was Germany's power, and he wanted to have the world power through have Germany rule the world. And national sovereignty basically just means sovereignty for your nation. You're supporting your nation, but you're a patriot. A better word for America would be patriot, because you believe in your national sovereignty under God. As long as your country is going forth the way it should be under God, we are okay. But as soon as our nation goes away from God, then we're not so supporting our nation above God. That's the difference. Just wanted to go over that. So let's see here. So trade organizations have now diminished national sovereignty to rule their own international affairs without foreign interference. And now we've diminished that, especially if we start joining these the World Trade Organization, and say, okay, we're going to let them decide who we trade with. Examples here. They put forth examples. The first example being the European Union. We went over that already in the last video. But it was formerly independent, giving powers, they basically just trading as a common market. But now they have grown larger in the European Union, controlling with an international court, meaning they could now, their court system, their judicial system, within countries, they can go in and sue countries, I should say, or they can have court decisions above these nations. Also, the World Bank, in the midst of the EU, and they have their own parliament and that rules these countries. So each of these countries, which are 27 and more, I don't know how many right now, but they're all coming together. Each one of them are actually giving up a lot of their national sovereignty to be part of the EU, European Union. So the United States, has surrendered much of its national sovereignty to different agreements, and one of us, of course, we went over is NAFTA. In fact, in NAFTA, when you think of NAFTA, what did I tell you about NAFTA in the last video? NAFTA is the North American trade organization between the United States, Canada, and Mexico. So, and so now with that, when you think of that is kind of basically that surrendering. We have now all these rules and regulations to go by, as we have surrendered to NAFTA. And in fact, there's 1,200 pages here of rules and regulations and penalties and fines. So it's putting America under. And because both Canada and Mexico, they are lesser, especially Mexico, is basically a needy country, that the United States has actually signed to take care of these countries in this way, And the policies now you have to have Canada and Mexico agree on these policies too, with all these rules and regulations of NAFTA. Not so good. So the United States now, let's go on to this other where it talks about the world trade. Picture here. Here's a picture. 1,200 pages of rules and regulations, and they call it a free trade agreement with NAFTA. So, but now we're talking about world trade here. So, the world trade, the United States was to grant special privileges under the World Trade Organization. And so, of course, the United States was not trading with China because of China's stance on communism and its basically stance on abusing its own people, So the United States didn't until, it was under President Nixon. And through the World Trade Organization, we were required to take communist China as a most favored nation. Now, that we could not discriminate, that we had to, through world trade, say that they were most favored nation, that we had to trade through China, or, trade with China. And this restricted our country from any other beneficial deals with these, that basically the World Trade Organization telling us it's important, and that missed the whole thing. Nixon went to China and all these things. Wasn't really the greatest thing, because the trade, when you think of that, basically we went against our moral principles, because China, not only that was communism, but also was abusing its own people in many ways. And instead of refraining, we put them as most favored nation. Crazy. So better approaches to world trade would be bilateral trade. Bi meaning two, where only two countries, are dealing with each other. So in that way, we're not going to take away their sovereignty. If we're just dealing with one country, say that we were just dealing with England, at that time, then both we could look and we both agree, and we're not taking over their sovereignty. Two 2 bilateral trade agreements would be better than sticking in 29 other people to say what they think about this subject, right? Or to even put in one more. So anyway, that's what basically is for trading. So now we don't get into how huge, gigantic organization, right? I have to do. So, okay, that's about it for when we're going over international trade. The next we need to go over here. Here, like this, where it says the United States should work to obtain free trade the traditional way, negotiating one nation at a time. And of course, they give us the proverb there that says, "A good name is rather to be chosen than great riches, and loving favor than silver and gold." Let's focus on God, is what it's saying. So the next thing we went over was we're talking about trade, and that's how we have to trade with other countries, and so that international trade and how strong it's getting right now. And now we're going to get into world peace, because that's another thing we're dealing with in organizing these international organizations. One of the ideas, we have to have these organizations for world peace. So the opinion is that if we lose our trade agreements between our troublesome governments, then we're going to have economic hazards, and we're not going to be able to get along and end up in war, And so they think losing trade may end up causing us to be put into not peaceful situations with other countries, and these leading to war. But history, it says, has been otherwise. Why? Well, we look into Germany and Great Britain. And it says here, they were trading partners in the 1900s, and basically trading goods quite often, but this didn't stop war, did it? Because Germany, despite, the trade stopping or going, didn't matter. They still went to World War I and World War II, with Germany standing up against, caring not about any trade, whether it was with Great Britain or any other country, so really it didn't matter. Trade didn't matter because we had a tyrant, especially when we had a tyrant under Adolf Hitler. Another example down here, it talks about Saddam Hussein, another one. He went in and invaded the tiny rich in oil in 1991 of Kuwait. And so everyone said, well, we're going to cut off trade to Iraq, that's where Saddam Hussein was coming. And so we're gonna make it hard for that country and cut off trade. But Saddam Hussein could care less if they cut off trade. He was going to attack. In fact, he had the idea too that he would be the ruler of the world and take over the Babylonian Empire and be like the incarnate Nebuchadnezzar or Nimrod. He wanted to be an Antichrist figure. So he could care less about world peace and world trade. So it doesn't matter. A lot of wars have nothing to do with trade, is what we're saying. So it's important to look at, when I look at world wars and stuff, and I think the best thing is to go into a country and bring forth the gospel and lead the country, people in the country to the Lord. And that way, more countries standing for God will bring in God's grace and mercy and leadership that would be more righteous. But that's not the way the world agrees. So they want to be. There's these tyrants that want to rule the world, right? Because of the heart of man is deceitfully wicked beyond measure. So, so the moral arguments for globalism mostly, are focused on world peace. Like, we need globalism because we need world peace. Well, that seems, pretty important, but. How do we keep this world peace? And how do we do it through globalism? Well, anyway, on to another moral argument would be aiding the poor. So the less developed countries, so globalism needs to help these countries develop, and maybe they'll develop in peaceful ways. Maybe. Or again, we'll go into protecting the environment. And we'll be getting those probably in the next video here, because I don't think I'm going to get them all, maybe. But so the UN puts forth this UN Population Fund Executive Director, um, Babat, Babatunde Asatomehin. I can't pronounce his name. Asatomehin. Anyway, it sounds, hopefully I didn't mess that up, but he said, we must tear down economic, legal, and social barriers to put women and men and boys and girls on equal footing in all spheres of life. So his assumption is that all nations need to be equal, right? So that then we won't engage in war if we're all equal. Sounds like communism, doesn't it? So I don't know if I want to go with any UN executive, that's for sure. Because since 1945, well, anyway, the assumption, going back to that assumption, this assumption will cause reluctance to wage war, basically saying the preamble of the United Nations first saying, we want to save the scourge of war, have faith in human rights, promote social programs to better the standards of life. Sounds good, but are they really doing that? So let's talk about the United Nations in their peace, trying to promote peace. Let's talk about the history of them too. So since 1945, that's the year the United Nations was formed, we've had hundreds of wars. And the United Nations has failed to prevent any of them. Zilch, right? It hasn't helped. I call it do nothing, actually. UN is basically undoing, doing nothing, do nothing, because it hasn't prevented any wars. We've had, hundreds of wars. Also, the UN has overlooked or even aided aggression. So when they saw aggression, because the United Nations and the countries could not agree, a lot of times they've aided aggression against each other. The UN also has expanded totalitarian regimes because they do promote countries like China and Vietnam with totalitarian regimes. The United Nations also has failed to oppose oppressive and abusive governments in the total. United Nations founders secretly or even openly were socialists or communists in the United Nations, including the founder of the United Nations, or one of the founders of the United Nations. So we're basically blatantly socialist communist. In fact, in the San Francisco conference, the American who had organized was named Alger Hiss. And he was the Secretary General of the United Nations, and they put forth their conference in San Francisco, and he drafted the United Nations Charter. And later on, he was even implicated, I should say, as a spy for the Soviet Union. Alger Hiss was a communist, and he organized the United Nations. So, in fact, the American Communist Party said, I need not be a member of the United Nations to know the blueprint is a communist one. Ha, ha, ha. He's saying the American Communist Party says, yeah, the United Nations, the whole blueprint, Alger Hiss, and the whole deal is communist. So the United Nations pattern has been, a sociological communist conquest in many ways, because it's patterned to aim and serve the communist penetration of the West. It's very deceptive, but that's what they're doing. Communism coming in saying we're not going to have the free, we don't believe in free enterprise. We don't believe in capitalism. We don't believe the freedom of speech. We don't believe the freedom of religion. We're going forth through this communist agenda through the United Nations. Let's just say they're communist. In fact, even the Soviet KGB officer Viktor Lazovsky, he says, Lenin's ideas of peaceful coexistence have won international acceptance in line with aims of the United Nations Charter. So he said, yeah, the United Nations Charter is actually the same as Lenin and communism, going back even to Karl Marx, right? So here, the Soviet leader, the American Communist Party leader, Alger Hiss, spy for the Soviet Union under communism, They were instrumental in putting together the United Nations. So why should we even be in the United Nations? But we are. The U.S. has really been sought peace through the United Nations, right? Trying to say, okay, let's work under the United Nations for world peace. But guess what happens? The United States has become the peacekeeping. They want to use all of our military and all of our might to stand behind their agenda, which now is our mixture with our agenda. So they've sponsored the United States as their peacekeeping, peacekeeping force, military force. So, and the United States has paid dearly for these military ventures with the United Nations. Many of our soldiers have been killed, and we spent billions of dollars and to do with the United Nations. And when we think of the nations involved, we've had no respect of them. They resent our interference anyway. So it's crazy when we're dealing. So United Nations, when you mention their name, it's like we need to get away from the United Nations. So here's a picture. It says, no, Katya, the ones with blue helmets are the peacekeeping troops. Blue helmets were the United Nations. They're supposed to be peace. Here's a picture. The UN tanks and peacekeeping troops have become familiar sights in many of the areas of the world. So here's United Nations. So we know going on here, we went over all this here, the communist influence in the United Nations. So I'm just going to find my place here. So the UN wants, this last part here to deal with the UN before we get into humanitarian aid. The UN wants to deprive our country of our national security. What am I saying? Well, the United Nations would love to have us de-arm ourselves, so that saying, well, we'll stop war, let's de-arm, let's take away some of your military because you got too much power. The UN has said that, so, and going on, true peace comes through Jesus Christ. We know that until man's sin nature does not threaten, nations should be prepared to defend themselves. So we have to defend ourselves, because if we don't defend ourselves, they're going to walk right in and take us over, the totalitarian government. So to tell us that we need to disarm ourselves and decrease our military, their communist agenda comes through. This will make America very vulnerable. So we won't be able to protect ourselves and preserve our freedoms, like I said before. So we must have a military that's independent of these global organizations. We must be independent of the United Nations. And it looks back, and I know underneath, the Bushes, George Bush and George W. Bush, but especially George Bush, he was very into the United Nations. And so were a lot of presidents before. But now we look and say, New World Order, they call themselves. And that was way back under Bush. He said, we are in a new world order. We're following the United Nations. New World Order is a word for the end times Antichrist, isn't it? So that's really crazy. So another would be humanitarian aid. So let's get into that a bit. See if we can, maybe I can get through here. So let's speed it up a little bit. Humanitarian aid. So the globalism wants to end the plight of the poor of the world. And so, and knowing that we have some very wealthy countries like the United States, and that we have some very poverty-stricken countries, third world countries considered in that. So, but the Americans, the people, the world knows something about Americans, that they're very generous, they're very willing to give, they're very Christian-based, and they want to help people, especially poor. In fact, it is said, if you go into any organization like Compassion International, I went to Compassion International, and it said that 90% of the people that give to Compassion to help orphans, 90% of the money comes from the United States. And then it said 7% of that comes from Australia, which you wouldn't think. And then only 3% from the rest of the whole world. So 90% of humanitarian aid comes from our country, because people in our country have a compassion and want to help people around the world, and they feel like in America it's a moral obligation, which other countries, look at in the Muslim country and in other countries controlled by socialism and communism, they could care less of giving, right? But they know that the world knows that Americans are great givers. So they want America involved in their global their global organizations. So they want them the two big global economic organizations they want America to fund are the World Bank and then the IMF, which is the International Monetary Fund. And we talked about these already, these two. They want our money to come through there. They said, if you want to help these poor countries, you have to come through our organization. Do we want to do that? So they put the responsibility on themselves and say, we are helping these countries, so you can't just go in there and help them. We have to go through us. Baloney, but that's what they say. So both of these organizations, the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, IMF, have demonstrated they're not good vehicles for charity at all, that they're inefficient in helping poverty in these other nations. So if we put our money into supporting the World Bank going through this, we are just lost, because where does that money go? Do we know that it even goes to those countries that it needs to go to? So here's what the World Bank is helping third world governments cripple their economies, maul their environments, and oppress the people. It now consistently does more harm than good for the world's poorest. James Bovard. So you see here what's being said. They are not helping these poor countries. So what are they doing? Well, anyway, globalists. These guys are globalists of the World Bank and the IMF Monetary Fund. Right here, they say that there's certain, what they've labeled us as, that we have certain IACs. There are industrial advanced countries. There's certain industrial advanced countries, and there's certain less developed countries, LDCs. And they say the IACs need to help the LDCs. The rich nations need to not be getting richer, but they need to be giving their money to the poorer countries. A communist idea, indeed. They insist that the IACs, which we are part of, that we give vast amounts of money to these LDCs, lower countries, so. And they blame the poverty on us, saying, you need to give your money to them, right? And if you don't, then it's your fault they're poor. That's a communist way. So the World Bank and the International Monetary do more harm than good. And going back even to the development here, let's see. We're on 33 minutes in this video, so I think I'm going to stop and do the rest in the last, because I'm not going to be able to fit this all on. But, and I think it's so important. I know I was going to just whiz through, but you guys need to understand this. So let's go on to the next video.